we're going to talk a lot about that today. And we are going to spend some time talking about brain development, which can get a little dry and confusing. So I'm going to do my best to make it easy to understand today as we go. So how we're going to spend our time today, if I can get it to go, is spending some time talking about mental health in infant and young kids and gaining an understanding of why that's important to think about and how do we know that somebody in that age range has a mental health need. We're going to learn about stress and dysregulation and what in the world is dysregulation. How do we know somebody's dysregulated? What are different types and what causes it? And we're going to learn strategies on what to do if a child in front of us is dysregulated and how we can use our relationship to help us in that. Okay. So first, we're going to start with why is it important to think about infant and early childhood mental health? Anytime I talk about I work with babies and I'm an infant mental health specialist, I usually get some sort of funny look and how in the world are you doing therapy with babies? And why? They're just tiny humans that haven't had a lot of things probably that they need to work on. So we want to understand the definition of infant mental health. So infant mental health is defined as a child's capacity to experience, regulate, and express emotions. We want them to form close and secure relationships and explore the environment and learn. I think we can all agree that that's really our goals for infants, and that's something we all want to help support. So building these capacities in infants will best be accomplished within the context of a caregiving relationship. And it's the foundation for healthy social and emotional development later on. So as I was preparing for today, I was reminded that oftentimes we need to think about an infant's environment as their primary caregiver. They can't exist in an environment outside of that primary caregiver. So that's why it's so important for us to think about that relationship. Guiding principles for infant mental health work include that relationship framework when we're doing intervention or assessment. It's a strengths-based approach. So we're thinking strengths of both the infant and the family. And what are some protective factors? What are the family doing right? And where are some places that we can maybe intervene so that we can prevent future problems? And that's the last principle we want to think about is a prevention orientation. I also have noticed in doing more of my infant mental health work, how much that has changed the work that I'm doing with adults and teens and adopted kiddos or whoever it is in my office, because it's such an important framework and time in our lives that without understanding what babies need and maybe what we didn't get, it's hard to fix later things. So we can do a lot of work healing things of our own childhood hurts when we think in this lens. It's also really important to think about this time period because brain development is so huge during this time period. It begins during gestation, and that's when we start to develop our ability to regulate emotions as well. So since infants and young kids are dependent on others for such a long period of time, to be protective and have that care, it's important to remember that caregivers' responses and relationships in the environment, that all shapes brain development. So something to keep in mind is that when we are working with maybe young parents or parents and people who are pregnant, it's that whatever that person is experiencing, so is that baby. If we are pregnant and we get into a car accident, that baby feels that. They feel the tension, they feel the sudden disruption in their safety when they're in utero. Same thing if we have somebody who's experiencing intimate partner violence, that baby is also feeling that tension and that threat to their safety while they are in utero. So it's really important to keep that in mind when we're doing this work. So here comes the brain development step. So our brain develops from the bottom up. If you've done any learning about brain development, there's a lot of different ways that people talk about it. Bottom up, top down, upstairs, downstairs, sometimes the reptilian brain. Today, we're going to talk mostly bottom up, top down. So those will be the words that I use. So bottom up brain development means that we start developing, the first thing that develops in our brain is our primitive brain. And that is, it starts in gestation and goes through the first couple months of life. And this is the part that is based out of survival. It regulates our body functions like breathing and our heart rate and our blood pressure. It impacts sleep and appetite. So all the things that we need in order to survive. That's the first part of our brain that develops. Then we move into the limbic brain and the limbic system. The limbic system is our emotional processing of experiences and regulation. It has like attachment, and it's where our emotions start to come into piece or come into place. So that's where our second part starts to develop. And then we go to our cortical brain. So those are cognitive and executive functionings.
Oh, that's okay.
Oh, somebody's not on mute. If you could all just double check your settings, that would be awesome. So cognitive and executive functioning is all our thinking and rationalizing. And all of this development, all three parts of our brain develop within the first 3 years of life. So when the cortical and the limbic system start to develop, those are more of our top-down functions, where that bottom-up function is going to be that survival mode. So the period between 7 months in utero for a baby and 2 years of age constitutes a time of exuberance in the growth of the brain. There's so much brain development happening there. Neurons are firing, we've got pruning going on, and our brain is really starting to take shape. So just to think about it, when we are born with 25% of the weight. Our brain weighs 25% of what it will when we're an adult. By the time we hit age 2, we're at 75%. So just thinking about that, that's a huge growth and increase within our first 2 years of life. So it's really important for us to be aware of that and thinking about that right from the beginning of working with infants. Of course, there are genetic factors, so we can talk about nature and nurture, right? There's genetic risk factors that influence brain development, but really our experiences shape so much of our brain, especially during this period. It shapes how the child learns, how they're going to respond to the world, what messages they're getting. So something that I talk about a lot with families when I'm doing CPP, there's so many assessments that you do in that modality, and you get a lot of information about the child, but you get a ton of information about what the parent has experienced. And what I explain to them is that the experiences that we have in life, whether those are pleasant or unpleasant, it really shapes the way we understand and view the world. That's kind of what we hold our norm to. If I am an infant or a young child who cries and my caregiver is responsive and they come to me, I'm learning that my needs can get met. I can ask for help. There's somebody there who's going to help me, and I can rely on that. If I am a child who cries and nobody comes, I'm starting to learn that the world's not a safe place. I cannot ask for help. I cannot get my needs met. And so those are going to be some of those foundational messages that I'm going to have as I move through life. So understanding that environment shapes that development is so crucial. Around ages 3 or 4, especially, the brain is really easily influenced by environmental factors. So much more so than later on in life. And that's because 90% of our brain development all happens before we're 5. So that's such a short time for so much of our brain to be growing and learning and building. So positive influences during this time period like responsive caregiving or having appropriate stimulation and learning opportunities, that's going to support optimal brain development. On the flip side, unfortunately, it means our brain is very, very, very vulnerable to negative factors like neglect, abuse, and malnutrition. So if we think about it, this is kind of the time period that's like building a foundation of a house. If we are using not great materials, if we don't build a sturdy foundation or there's cracks in it, that house is going to need a lot of support later on. It's going to need to probably be rebuilt and fix those sturdy or those cracks. So I cannot get up here and talk about kids and brain development without talking about adverse childhood experiences and trauma. A lot of you may have already heard about adverse childhood experiences, but I'll just talk about what ACEs are. So ACEs are incidents that harm social, cognitive, and emotional functioning, dramatically upsetting the safe, nurturing environments children need to thrive. So when we're talking about an ACE score, they looked at the 10 most impactful ACEs that a child could experience. So those are things like parental substance abuse, experiencing physical abuse, sexual abuse, experiencing neglect, parental separation, incarceration, those kind of things. So while all ACEs are adverse, right? Not all kids might identify an ACE as traumatic, like divorce, for example. Not all kids identify that divorce was a traumatic experience. However, we know that that is a risk factor and a vulnerability for them that we should keep in mind when working with these kiddos. And even for adults, it's really important to keep this in mind. So I really love this graphic. I was newly introduced to it, and I think it's just so amazing. So we have these adverse childhood experiences that are things that we experience in our direct home lives, right? Like that, or the emotional or sexual abuse, substance abuse. But then we also have different factors that we need to take into consideration. Like if we're living in poverty, if we have poor housing quality, if we are victims of a system like systemic racism or policies or things that are actively working against us, those are adversities that are facing our families that we're working with. So it's important to factor those in as well, even though that's not part of the ACE score necessarily. So the ACE study was completed by Kaiser Permanente in 1995 to 1997. And it involved about 17,000 members who were part of their insurance program. The study set out to study weight loss, and it was a weight loss study, and they just happened onto this really like groundbreaking information. So it's really, my mind kind of is like, whoa, that is so cool, because you just like happen to discover this thing that is so groundbreaking and foundational to the work that we do. So participants were asked about their childhood experiences, current health functions, and behaviors while doing this study. And they started to notice some really weird results. People were dropping out, they weren't getting the results that they wanted, and they went and they took a look at the findings. And what they noticed were that these adverse childhood experiences were really common. And 2/3 of participants reported experiencing at least one ACE, where more than 20% reported experiencing 3 or more ACEs, and 12.5% reported 4 or more ACEs. So the data showed as well that women and minority groups were at greater risk for experiencing those ACEs. So when we start talking about 4 or more ACEs, that's where we see the greater risk. So as score increases, so do risk factors for individuals. And 4 or more is kind of the threshold. It doesn't matter if you have 4 or it doesn't matter if you have 10. It still has long-term predictors of risk. So for example, if you are reporting 4 times or more, or 4 or more ACEs, you are 60 times more likely to experience chronic depression. You're at an increased risk for substance abuse, and you're at an increased risk for attempting and completing suicide. So as ACE scores increase, so do our risk factors. And the more ACEs somebody has, the greater likelihood, unfortunately, of an earlier death as well. So knowing an ACE score really helps us to know, what is this person coming in with? What have they experienced? And knowing the risk factors for the population that we work in. And keeping in mind that these are all just risk factors. It doesn't mean that like things are hopeless. Like they're going to really struggle. They're not going to be able to overcome it. There's a lot of resiliencies that we can work on. And it's just making sure that we're addressing those traumas and helping people heal. So I thought it would be helpful to think about, what do ACEs look like in Iowa? If you haven't heard of ACEs 360, it's a coalition here in Iowa that works to study and prevent ACEs in Iowa. So they do some reports, and their most recent report was from 2020. They studied data that they collected in 2017 through 2018, and it was all adults. So we found that 63.7% of Iowa adults report at least 1 out of 10 ACEs. And then it's kind of broken down here what the percentages was. But if we go to the 4 or more ACEs, we're at 16.7% of Iowa adults are reporting 4 or more ACEs. And keeping in mind that our risk factors go way up as soon as we hit 4 or more. And so when they studied this data, they broke Iowa up into 6 different regions. And Polk County was included in region 1. And we averaged 17% of adults reporting 4 or more ACEs. So we're slightly higher than the average, but pretty close. The highest rate was 18.8%. And that was, can't remember where exactly in the state, it was on the east side of the state. But we were the second highest in terms of our region reporting that 4 or more ACEs. So this really speaks to the importance of utilizing a trauma-informed care framework when we're working with families and understanding how trauma impacts the individuals that we're working with. So instead of thinking like, what is wrong with you? We're thinking, what has happened to you? And we want to adopt something called universal precautions. So we just want to assume that everybody has some sort of trauma and develop systems, develop processes that all kind of go to mitigate the effects of trauma. So that might be like how I set up my office, making sure that that's really inviting and welcoming, thinking about how I'm talking to individuals, knowing that there could be triggers for a lot of reasons, or even clients don't come to see a lot of us on their best day, right? So they might not be in the best state of mind. And if we don't meet that with kindness, we are going to be triggering their trauma. So keeping that in mind and really focusing on that trauma-informed framework in all of the work that we're doing. So now that we understand a little bit about early childhood and trauma, we're going to talk about stress. So when we think about experiencing adversities, all of those are stressful. And those are stressful experiences that we are going to experience, because none of us can avoid having something happen, right? We all have something in our lives. So we're going to learn a little bit about how the body responds to stress. And to do that, we're going to meet our stress response system, because in order to understand dysregulation, we need to understand how this works. And dysregulation is something that occurs when the stress response system has gone wrong. So I always say, obviously, I love to learn about the brain. I think it's so interesting. And it's so cool to see what our brain kind of does in the different systems. I am terrible at remembering all the words and what things are called and their scientific name and all of that. So I had to refresh for today and make sure that I'm using the correct words. But I don't tell this to my families that I'm working with. I'm not saying, oh, that's your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala. I'm using very easy to understand words. So I'm going to give you their actual scientific names, and then we'll use some easier words later on. So first on our team for our stress response is our amygdala. That's the brain's fear center. It detects the threat in response to some sort of stimulus. And that's the part of our brain that holds our emotions. Our prefrontal cortex includes judgment, mood, and emotions. Our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, initiates cortisol, the long-lasting stress hormone in our body. And then we have the SAM axis. I am not even going to pretend that I know how to say that. So I'm just going to give you the acronym today. But that initiates production of adrenaline and noradrenaline, which is our short-acting stress hormones in our body. Then we have the hippocampus, which processes emotional information. This is really critical for consolidating memories. And lastly, we have the noradrenergic nucleus in the locus ceruleus. I practiced a couple times how to say that one. But this is the within the brain stress response system. This is the part of our brain that regulates mood and irritability and movement, arousal, attention, and it's part of our startle response. So to understand what that means in our system, we're going to use an example from Nadine Burke-Harris. If you have not heard of Nadine Burke-Harris, she is a doctor, I believe in Southern California, and she was working in an area that experienced some community violence, and she was working with young kids, and she was trying to figure out why her treatment attempts weren't working the way that maybe the textbook said they should be, and started to question this and then stumbled upon the ACE study. And now she's a huge proponent and advocate for ACEs, and it's just completely changed the way that she works as a doctor. So if you haven't already, she has a wonderful TED Talk out there on ACEs that's very informative. And she also wrote the book, The Deepest Well, which is where I'm borrowing this example from. So we're going to imagine that we are walking through a forest and we see a bear. Our brain immediately sends a signal saying, release that stress hormone. And it's going to cause our heart to start pounding. Our pupils are going to dilate. Our airways are going to open up, and we're going to get ready to either fight this bear or run away. This is the starting of our fight flight response, or we call it fight, fight, freeze a lot. And this response is intended to save our lives. Our amygdala, remember the emotional part, it lets us know, like, I should be really afraid of that bear. Like, this is scary. And our SAM and HPA axes then activate, and they trigger those hormones for the flight fight response. Our body starts to make adrenaline, and it gets amped up, and we are ready. We're going to fight this bear, or we are going to run. And if you really stop to think about it, I'm going to realize, like, whoa, Denise, you cannot fight a bear. This is nuts. So we shut that part of our brain off. We do not access our logic brain. We tell our prefrontal cortex to go offline because I don't need that right now. I need to focus on how to live. So I can't think about, like, whoa, I'm fighting a bear. Cortisol is released in our system. And cortisol is our long-term stress hormone. So really, cortisol helps our body adapt to repeated or long-term stressors as well. So it would be like if we were living in a bear-infested woods and we just happen to have a cabin there. Cortisol is going to help us adapt to living there. That might help us to sleep more, be a light sleeper so we can jump up and into action so that we can keep our system safe. Cortisol also triggers our body to crave high sugar and high fat foods, which is why, like, you really want some sugar when you are feeling stressed. Our one thing that doesn't often get talked about as part of the system is our immune system gets activated as well. So the reason our immune system gets activated is to prime our body to heal. So that means that, like, a lot of inflammation is happening because I know I'm going to fight this bear, and the bear is going to be much faster than me and stronger. So it's probably going to get a few licks in. And so my body is going to be primed to stabilize my injuries. So I'm going to already start some inflammation to be able to live through this to fight the bear. So that's really important to know, because when we see stress effects in our body for people who are struggling with that, we see a lot of inflammation for them. And that's why. Once we get away from this bear and we return to our cave and to safety, our SAM and HPA axes, they start to shut themselves down and the stress response system turns off and I get back to regulated. My logic brain comes back on, and I can continue to move forward. So now let's imagine that we lived with the bear. This might look like living in a home where there's intimate partner violence, or living with a parent who is struggling with their own stuff, their own mental health or their own substance abuse struggles, and they can't meet my basic needs because of their own stuff. Our bodies cannot differentiate between an actual bear in the woods and living in this environment. So the same fight, flight, freeze system is activated. This is going to lead to higher levels of cortisol in the body. It's really normal for us to wake up in the morning with a higher level of cortisol. It just kind of helps us wake up and get through our day. And then it's supposed to secrete throughout the day so that by bedtime, we feel sleepy. We can go to get off to bed and start a new day. Adversity, tragedy, and hardships are a part of life for all of us, like I said. So research tells us that those challenges can be overcome with the right support from a loving caregiver. But when we're living with the bear, we might not have that. So when our stress response system is activated too frequently, or if the stress is too intense, our body loses the ability to turn down that response. That's when we have that inflammation in our body, or we're getting those physical effects of the stress in our bodies. So our body is just going to keep like infusing cortisol into the system and blasting it at us. Essentially, our body's stress thermostat, it's broken and we can't turn it off. So when we think about stress, there's really 3 different kinds of stress that we're going to talk about. Positive stress, which is normal. It's an essential part of healthy development. It's that rush of nerves that we get before we do something, like give a presentation to somebody. Or when I was in high school, I was more of a theater person than athletic. So I think about that as a really great example, because, you know, you can hear the audience, you get the flutters in your stomach, the lights are out, the curtain is drawn. And then as soon as the curtain starts to go, you do it and you manage those butterflies and you can tolerate your stress and move forward. So that's a positive stress response. Then we have tolerable stress. This activates the body alert system to a greater degree, and it's a result of a more severe, longer lasting difficulty. So somebody might feel tolerable stress when they lose a loved one, or say there's a natural disaster and there's some impacts to your home because of that. We might see this in kids as, say, parents are getting divorced and kiddo reverts to some bedwetting. That is a tolerable stress response. Then we have toxic stress. Toxic stress is when a child experiences strong, frequent, and prolonged adversities. So these are our ACEs. This prolonged activation of the stress system can disrupt the development of brain architecture, and it's going to increase risk for stress-related diseases and cognitive impairment well into our adulthood. So again, these experiences when we're young kids, they have long lasting impact for how the rest of our lives go. So when infants and young kids experience stress and have that supportive relationship and environment, they develop a healthy stress response. And that's really what we want, right? Because none of us can avoid stress. And so we want to help our young kids figure out, what do I do when there's this stress in my body, and what's a healthy way to respond and tolerate that? So to learn a little bit more about this, we're gonna watch the still face. I've seen this video used in a lot of presentations, so some of you may have seen it as well. The still face experiment was developed by Dr. Ed Tronick, and it was used to study infant frustration and stress. Sometimes this video can bring up some feelings for individuals, but just know like this was a safe attached baby. So there was minimal damage done. So I'm going to let Dr. Tronick talk more about it.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So that's the still face experiment. And right there at the end, Dr. Tronick talks about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we can really think about that as positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. So with that ugly or toxic stress, there's no ability, or we're not letting babies go back to that positive response. And that stress then is sitting in their body. So we talked a little bit about cortisol already, but they have done some studies around cortisol levels for infants. And so for a securely attached infant, we see that fear-based and frustration-based tasks do not elicit a high variance in cortisol level. We more so see changes for them when there's maybe some more handling, which means like they're getting some physical exams, or mild pain, like getting an immunization. And then the biggest change for cortisol level for them was maternal separation. The first two, we saw cortisol levels and changes with that decrease around 6 months of age. With maternal separation, they're experiencing that increased cortisol level until about a year of life. And those were in securely attached kiddos. Insecurely attached infants showed greater cortisol levels in general, especially in response to fear tasks. So I think that really speaks to they are learning that their environment is not a safe place. And so their systems are already being flooded with cortisol levels because of it. And research suggests that fearful infants and infants with insecure attachment have more reactive endocrine systems. So they're just going to be getting that, they're going to have those broken stress thermostats already from that early on in life.
Babies this young.
Okay, so we're talking about infants and early childhood, but how in the world do we know if there's a concern here or if some intervention is needed? Because obviously infants aren't verbal, and no preschool child is going to come up to you and say like, I think I need to talk to a therapist or I need some support, right? So here are some things they're going to tell us in the way that they interact. So here are some things to be on the lookout for. So for an infant, if they're really hard to soothe or console, and we'll want to take out factors like, are they teething right now? Because like no baby soothes really easily when they're teething, right? But if that's more of their norm, if they're not really interested in what's going on around them or their environment, if they're having really strong reactions to touch or sounds, if your baby looks kind of fearful, and obviously those physical evidence of abuse and neglect. Toddlers are just like the most emotional little people. They have a lot of feelings in that little body. So it should raise a red flag for us if we have a toddler who's not very emotionally expressive. That's a concern. They're unable to calm themselves or seek out comfort from people. They don't have a lot of interest in things. Toddlers get into everything. So if we have a toddler who's just like sitting in a corner, not getting into it, we might label that as a super well-behaved kid, but that might actually be more concerning. We should see them getting into stuff. And they have inconsistent sleep patterns as well. And then more of our preschool age kiddos, they might not want to play with other people. A lack of stranger danger is a big red flag that something is maybe amiss with this kiddo and we might need to get some intervention or support going. If they're hurtful to themselves or others, and if they don't have like a lot of language or they appear delayed in their movements, in their words, those are things that give us some hint that maybe something's not quite right. And then if we think more of like our young school age kiddos, again, that sleep pattern being off, too much or too little, that's a sign from us that something might be going on. If they're expressing a lot of worry or fear, especially in comparison to other kiddos their age, if they start talking about concerns about how they look, having a lot of nightmares, feeling very rigid in their routine. So kids, especially kids with trauma, they want things to be predictable. And so like kids do best with a routine anyways, but especially our kiddos with trauma, they need to know like these things happen in this order. And that feels safe. So when they're really rigid with that and they're not really inflexible and maybe have big outbursts after something changes in their routine, that might be a red flag, especially if we can't soothe them after that happens. So we're going to use this brain image just to understand the brain a little bit. So when we're looking at this, we are looking at it from the back of our head. So this side with the cubicles, that's our left hemisphere, and this side that has the more idyllic, outdoor, artsy looking side, that's our right brain. So our left brain loves order. It's a really logical, that's our logical part of our brain. It's really literal, it's linguistic, and it's linear. So all of those L's, those are our top down functions. Our right side is more holistic and nonverbal. It likes facial expressions. It does things like eye contact and tone of voice and posture and gestures, and it's taking that in. It really specializes in those images, emotions, and memories. It cares about the meaning and the feel of an experience. So this is where like maybe traumatic experiences live, is in our right side of our brain. When the two sides are connected with those bridges, they are communicating, we are integrated, and we are regulated, and we can both feel and think logically about an experience. we're going to use the window of tolerance, which is a concept developed by Dr. Dan Siegel. We're going to talk about him a lot today. He is a neuroscientist that writes really amazing books. Like I said, sometimes my brain is like, I can't like manage all these brain words, and he writes in a way that like is super understandable and relatable. And I use this a lot with families when I'm trying to explain brain concepts to them, is I use Dr. Siegel's thing. So he developed the concept of the window of tolerance. So in this first image is the normal stress reaction. When we are inside our window, that's the zone that we're able to function in most effectively. We are regulated, we're grounded, we can compromise, we can be flexible, we can be present, we can think logically about something and access our left side of our brain, so we can like use some of that rational thought and reasoning. When we get pushed outside of our window of tolerance by whatever stressor, we get pushed into survival mode. So that's what happens when we're just in our right side of our brain, is we are in survival mode. That's all we care about, is how do I survive this moment? So when we're in survival mode, we might have two different types of behaviors. One being hyper aroused behaviors. Those are bigger and louder behaviors. We might appear like really anxious or angry. This might be when we're out of control or really overwhelmed. Our body might want to just run away and get away from whatever it is that's causing the stressor. This is where we see our fight or flight response as part of our stress system. Then we can also see hypo-aroused responses, and those are quieter in appearance. It's still a dysregulated response, but it is quieter. So it would be like we're zoned out, or we're numb, or we're frozen. This is where a freeze response lives. And in really extreme cases, this is where we see like dissociation, which is a fancy word, if you haven't heard of it, to say like we just disconnect from what's going on because like things are just too much. We have to find a way to turn that off. So we dissociate. So to understand this, I use this example a lot. Let's say I need to go to Target, and I don't know about your Targets, but my Target always seems to be like improving itself, which great for you, Target, but you're moving stuff. And let's imagine that I am having a grumpy day. I did not sleep well. I had a rough day at work. I went grocery shopping yesterday, which is my least favorite thing to do anyways. And I forgot toothpaste, and I'm out of toothpaste, and I need to go. And I go to Target and I go to the aisle, and they moved it. And I might start crying or yelling or screaming out of frustration because they moved my toothpaste. Nothing about my toothpaste being moved in a different aisle is threatening my safety, right? It's not a survival thing, but it has pushed me out of my window of tolerance because my window was already shrunk because I wasn't feeling regulated. I wasn't feeling good. So any little things, even though they might not be big things, can cause dysregulated responses, especially if we are not in a good window of tolerance. So I always say like our window can shrink based on what's going on for us. So to understand this, I've used the word a little bit, so now I'm going to explain what dysregulation means. It's just a really fancy word to say it's an emotional response that's not regulated well. It doesn't fall in what's an acceptable response, right? Me screaming and crying because I can't find the toothpaste, that's not probably a normal response, right? That would be a really big response for a little thing. So dysregulation is what falls outside of the window of tolerance. And to understand this, we want to understand behavior. We have a long history of looking at behavior as like intentional things. And so when we talk about behavior today, we're going to talk about behavior as it's the observable response to our internal and external experiences. It's going to be outward displays of a person's internal processes, whatever's going on inside. It's a response, their external response to their perceptions, their emotions, their thoughts. So We want to help kids learn how to self-regulate, which is the control of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. When we are regulated, it's because we feel safe. So keep that in mind. So to understand this, we're gonna use a concept from Dr. Porges' polyvagal theory. I've barely scratched the surface on polyvagal theory. It's really cool from what I have heard, but I have not done a lot of learning on it. I'm excited to do more, but I am gonna borrow this concept from it because we're going to use the concept of neuroception, which is something we all do. It's our subconscious surveillance of safety and threat in our environment. So we're all scanning, like, are we safe? Are there safe people around? Is there something in my environment that doesn't feel safe? And we are trying to perceive threat because we want to survive, right? So it's something that's going on for all of us. When we might get kicked outside of the window of tolerance might be because we mistakenly detected a threat in our environment. Even when we are realistically safe, there might be something that triggers us feeling that we're not safe, and it's going to trigger some of those defensive reactions, and it's essentially going to flip us into survival mode. So you might have heard the term like flipping your lid. So we get flipped right into survival mode and into our right brain. So we're going to go back to this brain image for a minute to think about this. So when I explain this to people, I think about, and actually this example that I used, I used to explain this happened to me yesterday. So when we get triggered and we're flipping into outside of our window of tolerance, on our cubicle side, the Wi-Fi goes out. And like, we can't do anything without the Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi went down in my office all day yesterday. And I am in a different office today so that I safely had the internet just in case for this presentation. But you can't do much without the internet, right? You can't Google things, you can't access data. Most of the things that I do now are saved through the internet. So there's nothing I can do when that Wi-Fi goes down and my logic and data brain is out. When that goes down, those bridges that connect the two sides, they stop working. They're out of order. And we are just living in our right brain. And while this image makes the right brain look like a wonderful place to exist, right? It is not when it gets triggered. It's all survival. All I care about is how do I get through this thing that I'm facing right now and make it stop. So that might be having a tantrum. It might be screaming until the other person stops, right? I'm just trying to survive in the moment. None of that, it logically makes sense, but I can't access my left brain to reason that. So all of our responses are going to be based out of survival. Once the bridges come back up and we can access our left side of the brain and the two sides are connecting, then we can think about responses that help us thrive and move forward. So that's when we're in our optimal zone, we're thinking about thriving. But when we are dysregulated, we are in survival mode and we're just thinking about that. So to understand this, we're going to talk a lot about how we see this in kids today, but we're going to talk about dysregulation, what that looks like, how to identify it. And there's a couple of different types that might want us to have different responses based on what's going on. So to do that, we're going to use a video again. So first, we're going to talk about physical dysregulation.
Can we turn the AC up? I'm dying back here.
It's on. Can't you feel it?
Can you feel that?
Oh.
Jeff, eat a Snickers, please.
Why?
Every time you get hungry, you turn into a diva. Just eat it so we can all coexist.
I turn into a diva.
Put it in your system, break your pants.
Okay.
Thank you. Better?
Better.
Will you get your knees out of the back of my seat?
Oh.
You're not you when you're hungry. Snickers satisfies.
I watched a lot of Snickers commercials to decide on which one to use, and there's a lot of good ones. But you're not you when you're hungry, right? How many of us have been hangry before? I get really hangry. I get very physically dysregulated when I am tired at night. This would be something that is physically causing us to be outside of our window of tolerance or causing us to not be able to handle our emotions well. So things like I'm really cold or I'm really hot. I'm wet. Ugh, I hate the sensation of wet socks on my feet. So if I'm walking with wet socks, I might get pretty cranky about it. And just being uncomfortable in our bodies. So for young kids, we might see this a lot when they're experiencing growing pains. That's a really uncomfortable sensation that they are dealing with. So I got permission to use this as an example, but I'm gonna pick on my mom for a moment. And I really saw this a lot as I was growing up as a kid and became older. But my mom, we tease her about it. She has something we call meltdown mode. She gets up pretty early in the morning, and when it gets later in the evening and close to bedtime, she's no good. She is in meltdown mode. She's super irritable. You can kind of see sometimes her brain takes a little bit longer to think about things. This is not a good time for me to maybe like ask her for money or talk about anything big because she's so physically dysregulated because her system is just exhausted. She's going to be irritable. It's going to make me be irritable in our responses. And neither one of us are going to be walking away from that conversation in a place that we feel good about.
Can we turn?
So then we have something called mastery dysregulation. And mastery dysregulation really happens when we are trying to learn something new and it's not clicking. So this might be like trying to learn how to tie a shoe. Trying to learn math and those concepts aren't clicking. Like you might start to feel that frustration and get a little dysregulated from it. I like to do crafts. And one year I was making a wreath for somebody for a gift. And I cannot tie a nice bow to save my life. And I bought the ribbon and I looked up YouTube videos and read some tutorials. And I was like, I can do this. I've got this. I've got all the instructions. I sat down, I tried it the first time and it did not go. And I was like, okay, first time, I'll try it again. And still not getting it. And by, the fourth, fifth, sixth time, I'm getting more and more frustrated because I cannot get this bow to the point where I don't remember how many attempts there were, but I know the end result was me throwing the bow across the room, a lot of angry gurrs happening, and I just bought a bow. But that was a time that I just could not get it. And I got so flipped out of my window of tolerance and got dysregulated that I ended up throwing a bow across the room, which typically I'm not somebody who throws things. So then we have sensory dysregulation. Sensory dysregulation happens when our five senses, there's just too much going on and our brain cannot process all of it at once. I also sometimes refer to it as sensory overload. It's just overwhelming and it's too much. I think about for kiddos, this might be things like going to the state fair or parade, right? That's a really exciting thing and they love it and they're excited, but there's a lot of people, there's a lot of noise. I may be hopped up on sugar and eating things and my little system can't handle it. And that's when we see those kiddos start to cry and have meltdowns. Add in that you're really tired during those things too, because you're walking everywhere. And it just causes our system to shut down a little bit to try to get us back to a more regulated state. And our last type of dysregulation that we're going to talk about is emotional dysregulation.
Webinar will begin shortly.
We are going to use a really silly video that's pretty funny to talk about it. However, while we're doing that, I would like everybody to try to notice like what similarities you're seeing between the kiddo reactions, what kind of behaviors are you observing, and then we'll chat about it.
And one more thing, on Monday night, I issued a challenge to the parents of America. I asked parents to pretend they ate all their kids' Halloween candy and videotape that and post it to YouTube under the heading, "Hey, Jimmy Kimmel, I told my kids I ate all their Halloween candy." And a lot of people did, and I guess I didn't expect so much crying. I kind of thought the kids would be mad. just mad. Almost every one of them cries.
Oh, sorry.
But we got what we got, and to those children whose tears are about to be immortalized on television, I apologize in advance.
I'm gonna tell you what happened to your candy, Blake. I ate it all. I ate yours too, Alan.
Me and Mommy ate it last night when you were asleep.
I ate all your Halloween candy last night.
Daddy, where's the candy?
What candy?
Please remain on the line. I think Adam ate all your candy. I'm so sorry.
I tricked you. Dad didn't eat all your candy.
Oh.
I tricked you. I'm very, very sorry, Rachel. I ate all your Halloween candy. How much was it? Oh, Rachel, I'm sorry. You know I like candy, Rachel. Do you still love me?
Ate all the candy. I'm so sorry. It's just I'm pregnant and I get really hungry. And I ate all of it.
I'm Dr. Jeff.
Very good, Cat. You didn't eat all the candy. Jimmy.
Cat, please get more candy. I ate them last night. I took them to work with me.
Last night we stayed up and we ate all your candies. Are you guys okay with that? Natalie, calm down, Natalie.
In order to develop
I ate all your candy. You have no more Halloween candy left.
She ate it. The heck?
Don't you guys think you ate enough candy last night?
No, I only have like one bite of candy. Are you serious? Are you like the rest? Oh, good for you. Now you're gonna probably get a bellyache. Why you should eat so much candy? Mom, that's two.
$430 million.
To what?
2 bags of candy.
Around the world.
Plus 2 is equals 5. Jim, you were so close. Did you see how much I had? I went to a lot of houses.
I know. I ate it all. It tasted so good, especially the peanut butter cups.
You sneaky mom!
Thanks to all the sneaky moms and sneaky dads. Kids are very unstable.
So a very silly example. Okay, I think somebody has something going in the background. I'm hearing a lot of feedback. So if we can just double check that we are muted, that would be great. Very silly example. It's one of those things, like I remember when this video came out and I was like waiting for it each year because it's so funny. But then you start to think about it in an emotional dysregulation lens, and it can be a little bit sad now. So what are some of the behaviors that you all noticed, or just similarities that you saw? If you want to throw those in the chat, you can unmute to say them. Some pretty instant crying happened. I noticed a lot. Yep, falling to the floor, big body movements. They just like melted instantly. Some shock and disbelief of like, how dare you? Meltdowns and tantrums, throwing things. We saw the one kiddo hauled off and punched the wall. And we also saw, I think her name was Rachel, and she kind of took off running. So we saw a lot of different behaviors, and there was a lot of similarities. That last set of kiddos, the kiddo in the red pajamas seemed like he was angry and frustrated, but it seemed like he had some access to his logical brain. Like, I worked really hard for that. That's not fair. And we heard a lot of mean words like "you're ugly." And so we saw a lot of similarities in responses here. So emotional dysregulation really occurs when emotions are just too strong. They're too big. And it just feels too big in my body and I don't like it. I'm having a hard time sitting with that. So this can happen both for like those pleasant emotions and unpleasant emotions. I have a kiddo right now that I'm working with who gets pretty dysregulated, especially when we talk about feelings. So if I bring up feelings, we have a pretty instant dysregulated response. And it includes a lot of like kicking, have gotten kicked, attempts to punch, throw things at me. It's like, whoa, I'm having a big response because you talked about something that doesn't feel safe. And like, oh, that must have been really sad. And it's instant dysregulation. And then we see those big fight responses. But same kiddo who we use, I have no idea what they're called, but it's those like spiky balls that you can pull out and push back in. And I use that for breathing a lot of times. Like we breathe out or deep breath in, deep breath out, and we use it to kind of regulate our breathing. And use that in session. Kiddo loves it. So I got one for them to surprise them with at the end of session. And I hid it behind my back. And apparently, I don't think they've ever done that before, like pick a hand. So that was kind of a surprise. So when I brought the little ball out, it was a dysregulated response, but in a different way. Our body got kind of like itchy and wiggly. We hid behind caregiver, couldn't make eye contact and turn away. And caregiver attempted to prompt like a thank you, but kiddo could not access that yet. And when as the words started to come, they were not nice words. It was like, that was so mean that you hid that behind your back. And I was like, I'm so sorry. Like, that's a fun thing people do sometimes to surprise you with something. So wasn't expecting like, I'm going to get dysregulation from this kid with this fun surprise, but I still saw it. So it's just about our body not being able to tolerate an emotional response, especially if those emotional responses are unexpected. Okay, so this graphic really outlines different fight, flight, freeze behaviors. So if we take a look at it for a second and think about the video we just watched, what are some behaviors that we can identify? We saw a lot of the yelling and the screaming and the using the mean words, hitting things. We saw a lot of body flopping, which isn't really necessarily on here. We saw wanting to run away and escape. We saw Rachel run away. Like, I can't look at you right now. I need to go hide. I'm sure there were a lot of these that like bodies felt really itchy and wiggly. And then we didn't see a lot of freeze responses, but we can be safe to assume that a lot of the videos that were taken probably were in safe caregiving relationships. So we might see more of a freeze response for a kiddo who doesn't have a safe caregiving relationship. And that might be shutting down, being pretty verbally unresponsive, or just using, I don't know a lot. Sometimes when I ask a kid a question, especially if that question has any hint of a feeling word in it, the response is always, I don't know. Like, I don't know, I can't think about it. And it's instant. And they start to shut down. So we can see this in a lot of different ways. I really like this graphic because it helps us kind of think about like, what response are we seeing? Is this kid in their fight, flight, freeze mode? And then what do I need to do to help that? So dysregulation can look like a lot of different things. In infants and toddlers, we're going to see that really like big tears or tantrums, and they're not going to be easy to soothe necessarily. We're going to see gaze aversion in infants. So gaze aversion is when an infant turns away to break that connection. So think about a time if you've ever had like really intense eye contact with somebody and it's like not a person, and I think eye contact can make us feel kind of weird anyway sometimes, but like it's not a person that maybe we're used to or don't have that relationship with. And sometimes it can get too much for us and we have to turn away. We have to break that connection. And that's a way that we are just kind of turning that down and making it more tolerable for ourselves, because that gaze and that eye contact is too intense. So we see that with infants quite a bit, where infants will like stare at you forever if you let them sometimes. So, we might see a baby who's really still and not a lot of activity, or on the flip side, we might see like way too much activity and their system's getting really activated. And in response to some sort of stimuli, we can see that a lot. Like when they get excited, they'll do the feet kicking and everything. But we might see that in response to like a stressor or something that scares them as well. Throwing things, head banging, scratching, those kind of behaviors. Those are all dysregulated behaviors. And for elementary kids, we might see things like lying. I refer to lying a lot as storytelling, because lying is a behavior that we see in our right brain. Kids a lot of times might tell me a story and I might know like, that's not true. And the more I double down and I'm like, or I say like, that's not true, the more that kiddo is going to dig in to like, yes, it is, because they're just in their survival mode and survival wants to win. Right. So they want to win that. And like, it is true. And I need you to believe that. So sometimes you just have to pick your battle and like, okay. And then later on, when their left brain comes back online, they might be like, you know what, Denise, I actually don't have a dragon that lives on top of my house. That was just something I told you. And I just, what? And you just go with it and like use that relationship and have fun with it. It didn't hurt anybody for them to tell me a story. A lot of times we talk about manipulation. I don't like this word, but it's an easy word to think of. So I think of this more as they are getting their needs met. Kids are not manipulative. Manipulation is more malicious in intent, right? Where kids are just trying to meet their needs. And so they might be doing things that look manipulative, but they are trying to get something met. And so it's really important for us to think about that. We see that physical aggression, the yelling, the mean words. We also see, I didn't put it on this list, but something that I see a lot is a silly reaction. So kiddos can get, I call it their silly part when it comes out, but they get this really silly thing. They might get giggly. They might start doing things, and something's going on internally that they can't tolerate. So they're trying to turn that heat down. And so they get really silly in session. So we might see all of those different things. And especially if you're like trying to do something, the last thing that we can tolerate is like silliness sometimes. We're like, come on, we got to be serious. We got to do this thing. But knowing that that is a kiddo's response to something not feeling safe. And sometimes parents and professionals alike assume or we forget how when self-regulation happens and what like actual skill level is. So we assume toddlers like can handle it and they can control their emotions and they can self-regulate. However, developmentally, that doesn't even start until they're like 3.5 or 4 at the very earliest. So they are very emotional little beings and they don't know what to do with it. So just keeping that in mind and remembering that when we are working with this age range. When we are thinking about behaviors, we need to remember that behaviors communicate a need. When we see a behavior, oops, I went one too far. I was trying to move the picture. So when we see a behavior that is problematic or confusing, the first question we should ask isn't how do we get rid of that, but rather what is the child telling us and what is the behavior telling us about the child? So we need to remember that it's communicating something to us, and all behaviors are in a response to stress. Kids don't just act out, it's because something internally is going on. So we want to get out of thinking that like, oh, they're acting out for attention. This is an attention seeking behavior, because that's not true. if anything, we can think about it as a connection seeking behavior. They have a need, they're trying to connect with something or someone. It might be that they're trying to connect with the two sides of their brain. They might be trying to connect with us as their caregiver or their safe person. So we really need to shift our framework and how we're thinking and understanding things. So we want to shift our thinking. We're again going to go back to what has happened to you when we're looking at a behavior. We're going to think about that, and we're going to think about those ACEs and the brain development and all of that stuff, and not what's the matter with you. I work with a lot of my population has experienced trauma. So I've worked with adopted teens and older kids. And a very common conversation I have with families is that, like, they were only in this environment that wasn't safe for 2 years. I've had them since they're 2 and they're now 16. Why is that? So why are we struggling like this? I've had them longer. And being able to explain that brain development and that foundation of the house, right? That foundation is a little bit rocky. And that's what we're seeing here, is that's what they're responding from. And it has nothing to do with the caregiver or what they haven't done. It's about that foundation that they experienced. We want to think about, why is that happening? So what have they experienced? What's going on? Are they feeling hungry? Is it around nap time? Like, why are we reacting this way? What's going on inside? Are they struggling with a big feeling? What is it? What is this behavior communicating to me? Which sometimes can be kind of hard to think about because behaviors can communicate things in really weird ways. So sometimes we have to get into our grounded brain to think about, like, what is this behavior communicating? Is it communicating that there's a lack of skill here for this kiddo? Is it communicating a need? Is it a connection seeking? And we want to think about, is this behavior top down or bottom up? So to think about that, we want to think, is this behavior purposeful? Is it intentional? Or is this behavior more reflective of a developmental challenge or a reflective response to a perceived threat? So that second one is going to be a bottom up response. So top-down behaviors are brain activities that reflect our conscious thinking mind. It's conscious effort to do it. It's intentional, it's rational, it's thoughtful. So an example of a top-down behavior might be a preschool age kiddo who has just learned, like, I can be kind of independent, and like I can have my own thoughts and I can do things for myself. And they might like get really stubborn, and I'm going to get myself dressed today, or I'm going to pour the juice. And parents might be looking at it like, this could just go so much faster if you let me do it. And preschool kiddo is going to say, no, I've got this. I want to do it. I want to do it for myself. They're all thinking top down. I'm learning how to use my things. I'm learning about the world. And they really want to be intentional with that behavior. A bottom up behavior, we're born with those. That's our survival brain. So they help us stay alive. They are reflexive. They're automatic responses. And it's really more subconscious. There is some sort of perception of a threat. And that threat underlines these behaviors. So it's emerging out of our self-protection instincts. And it can look really weird. Like, me throwing a tantrum is not necessarily like a way that I keep myself safe, but if it gets the thing to stop, that's how I'm keeping myself safe. I'm yelling until I get what I want. Or that toothpaste is not, again, a threat to my survival, but I'm yelling until I get it, because that's what's going to help my body feel safe in the moment, because that's my need right now. So responding to behaviors and dysregulation, we really want to think about this when we're shifting our thinking. It is not a one size fits all approach. It's really unique to the child's individual needs, what has happened to them, what's going on. And we want to try to tailor that to what we know about the kiddo. So we're going to use some concepts to think about this from Dr. Siegel. So the first step in helping children with challenges is to use connection and hopefully use our secure relationship with them. So young kids are right brain dominant. They live in their feelings, and they get stuck in that right brain quite a lot. So when something's going on, we want to connect about the feelings first. We're going to go to that first. We're going to validate it. We're going to notice it. So to connect on an emotional level, we want to think safety. What's going to help somebody feel safe right now? And if I'm a tiny human that's only like, a couple feet tall and I have a big, tall adult, even though that's a tall adult, I don't feel safe in that moment because there's such a height difference. And like you're over me and talking, and that can feel scary in my body. So we want to get down on the child's level and we want to connect with them, and we want to have a nurturing tone of voice. We want to make eye contact and use our nonverbal signals. If it's safe to do that, we can use physical touch if we have that relationship and safety with the kiddo. Sometimes physical touch is really, really triggering for a kid, though, especially when they're in their right brain. So we might not want to touch them. And we just want to make sure that we're using our empathy and that our body language and what we are doing is expressing that. We need to realize that logic is not going to be accessed right now, and that is not the solution to calming this down. I got to connect with those feelings first, and that's the only shot I got in making this a little bit more tolerable for all of us. We're going to increase the child's attunement with themselves by using our right brain to bring their right brain back into balance and to help them get regulated. So once we're able to connect on that feelings first, then we can respond by connecting with the left side of the brain. So in order to explain our side and like move forward in a logical, rational way, we need to help shift from the survival mode and bring that left brain into the conversation and get to a place of thriving. So in case you can't read it, I'm just going to read the comic out loud because I'm sure the type is very tiny. But the top one says, instead of command to demand. So kiddo is saying, Mom, you never leave me a note in the middle of the night, and I hate homework. What are you doing out of bed? Go back to your room, and I don't want to see you again until morning. A connect and redirect approach might look more like, Mom, you never leave me a note in the middle of the night, and I hate homework. We get on the kiddo's level and we say something like, I get frustrated about things like that too. Want me to leave you a note tonight? And I've got some ideas about homework, but it's late now, so let's talk more tomorrow. So we're connecting on that emotion, and then we're redirecting to what we want, which is get back in bed. But trying to move in a way that is going to help bring both sides of the brain back online. And so when we're doing this, we also want to keep in mind, sometimes we go to trainings and we get all these beautiful examples and they work wonderfully, and you talk about them in that way. It doesn't always work. Okay. Some days you're going to do it and it's going to work beautiful and you're going to be like, oh my gosh, that was awesome. And some days are just really, really hard. And this is not going to work. You might get a kiddo back to regulated and 5 minutes later, they're back to dysregulated. So we need to ride through that wave, and some days those waves are really choppy, but keeping in mind on those days, it means that the kiddo is perceiving a threat somewhere in their environment. They are not feeling safe in some way, shape, or form. And so that's what we want to help try to do, is help them come back to that safety. So what kids need when they experience strong emotion is to have someone help them use their brain to make sense of it. We often think about the things that we have to teach kids, right? They don't come programmed knowing their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, and we're really intentional about teaching that. But sometimes we forget, like, we got to do the same thing with feelings and what those things are. They don't know that when this thing is happening, I'm feeling this way. So we can do that, and we can help them teach feelings in a couple of different ways. One of which being using feelings word as we go throughout the day. Like, I'm feeling really happy to spend time with you, or whatever it is, just to help bring some of that language into our day-to-day. And then when something's going on, we can assign words to the feeling that they are experiencing. So like, you're feeling really mad that we can't go to the park right now. Being able to help them make sense of like the outward display and what that feeling is. And we can use storytelling to do that. So we're going to put the events in order. Like, you're feeling really mad that we can't go to the park right now, but it's thunderstorming, so it's not safe for us to go to the park right now. And what we're doing by doing that is we're helping to integrate the two sides of the brain and bring logic back into the conversation, so that we can hopefully move forward from that perspective. So when we are teaching kids about feelings, we can teach them, it's really important to teach them that feelings are temporary. They're not going to last forever. So we can do this by thinking about like a rainstorm. When there's a rainstorm and it's downpouring, we know like, okay, it's raining, and I might need my umbrella, and but I know that it's not going to last forever. I know the sun's going to come back out again. I know the sun is going to shine. It might not always feel like that, especially on like when we have like those week-long rainstorms. But we know logically, when we can access our logic brain, that I'm going to see the sun again. So emotions are like rain. They come, they visit us, they tell us a little bit of information, let us know how we're feeling about the world, and then they move on. And so it's really important to help our kiddos understand that you're not going to be stuck in this feeling forever. We want to try to engage with that left side of the brain instead of enraging the right side of the brain. And so it's really important to think about ourselves too, because a lot of times when we have a dysregulated kiddo, we might have our own reactions. I do still. And like, I'm like, oh crap, what do I do? Like, this is a lot. Or if I'm not feeling regulated that day, my control side might come out. I might feel really like I have to control the environment, because that helps us feel safe when we can control. So when I get really overwhelmed, I want to just like be in control, and I see my control pieces come up. So having some self-awareness of that, and not commanding and demanding, which is something that we often do with our kids. We want that awareness of the sides of the brain and how that is going to have a direct and immediate impact with our kiddos. I am not a rebellious person, but if somebody is telling me to do something and I'm not feeling regulated, I am going to double down instead of like being able to talk about it and have somebody connect with like, I see you're overwhelmed, and like validate my feeling. And then we can logically move into something. So we want to identify that emotion, and then we can work on problem solving together in order to engage with the left side. So this comic, kiddo is saying, I hate you, mommy. And mom is saying, this is not okay to say. I don't want you to say that ever again. Instead, to engage the upstairs brain, kiddo might say, I hate you, mom. Well, wow, you're really mad. Yeah, I hate you. It's because I didn't get you that necklace. Yes, you're so mean. And then mom says, that necklace wasn't for sale. It's okay if you want to keep feeling upset, but if you'd rather, we can talk about problem solves and think of another idea. And then kiddo says, how can we do that? Again, a beautiful example that might look a little bit different in practice, but that's the general idea, is trying to connect on that feelings and help them put into words what's going on in their body. And we want to think about this using something called the SIFT method. So the SIFT method, we want to think about sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, just to help us provide some understanding, both for what we think is going on and help the kiddo understand what's going on. So helping kids understand that sensations and how they help us. So how you can become aware of what's going on inside of our body by how the sensations are feeling. I don't know if any of you have ever mentioned butterflies in your tummy to a kid. When they're younger and you say like, oh, I wonder if you have butterflies in your tummy, they get really confused about that. And they're like, no. And they don't realize that that's the way we talk about like little flutters in our belly and we're feeling anxious. So helping them understand that that sensation, that's a feeling visiting us. And it's important for us to listen to those sensations because it's telling us what's going on in our body. images or memories that may affect the way they understand the world might be coming up for them. So going back to thinking about that foundation of the house. And even though maybe this is a kid who's been with you for a lot longer, their foundation and images are coming up, and that's informing how they're responding. So knowing what has happened to a kiddo again. Feelings and emotions they are experiencing. And we want to try to be really precise with that, because that's going to help them develop it. But most kids are going to try to get away with saying like, I'm fine, or it just feels bad. And like, those are not feelings words. So I always try to use a feeling word to help them build capacity for identifying what's going on. That is what mad feels like in your body. Sometimes I will be honest that like, I don't know what's going on. So I just say like, you're having a really big feeling right now. And that sometimes just helps enough to be like, oh, that's what's going on with my body. Something is happening. I don't identify the emotion directly, but it's still enough to like, I see that something's happening with you. And then we can calm and we might get to like, oh, I was feeling really mad in that moment. Thoughts, and those are going to represent the left brain part of this process. So that's how we maybe narrate the story. And so it's important to know maybe what self-talk or thoughts are looking like for our kiddos. They might tell themselves a story about an event. And a lot of time when our brain doesn't have a clear explanation for something, we blame ourselves and we create some negative beliefs about ourselves. So say for a kiddo who's used to getting pretty good grades, they fail a test and the test was really hard and everybody in the class failed. Logic brain is going to be like, that test was hard. Nobody did well. My feelings brain is going to think I'm really dumb. I'm dumb and I'm not smart enough to do this. And that's the story I'm going to tell myself. So knowing maybe when kiddos get stuck in their right brain and what kind of stories that right brain might be holding about ourselves can really help us to figure out how to support that kiddo moving forward. So when we're doing that, we need to remember that our relationship is key. Relationships have huge predictors of success for kiddos. Our research shows that having a positive relationship with another human being helps the brain to heal. So the more safe, helpful relationships we can have, the more we can help those brains repair maybe some early hurts and feel that safety. So with that in mind, we all have the ability to impact the relational connection. It doesn't matter if you are working with the parent in that context, if you're working with the child. A lot of times you can be working with the parent and building their own supports and capacity, but also then helping to influence the connection time and support they might be getting with their kiddos. Sometimes the biggest thing that we might be doing in our work with kids is just being a safe person for them and letting them know that they are appreciated and seen and valued. So relationship really is key when we are doing this work. So part of our relationship and helping kids learn how to regulate is using co-regulation. So when we think about regulation is it's again being able to like manage and control our thoughts and feelings. And it's really essential to healthy social and emotional development. We learn how to self-regulate by co-regulation, which is really us using a warm and responsive interaction with another person that provides support, coaching, and modeling. It helps kiddo understand and express and modulate their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So that's what regulation and co-regulation is. So if we can think about this, we can think about it kind of like a kiddo being a furnace and the parent or the adult being the thermostat. The furnace might be really blasting hot and out of control and like pumping a lot of heat. There's a lot of big feelings there. We as the thermostat can help turn that furnace down and help them by co-regulating. They can start to feed off of my energy. I'm going to use my relationship to help that furnace calm down and cool. So really just remembering like, we're working together in that. And even though the furnace is separate from the thermostat furnace is dependent on the thermostat to regulate it, right? Kids learn to self-regulate through this. When they learn they can trust their adults in their world, and that they know that their needs will be met, they can start to relax. And then they start to develop their own self-soothing behaviors, like sucking on their fingers or being able to like soothe themselves to sleep. Learning to self-regulate by experiencing tuned in caregiving in early childhood is very important. And it's really linked to greater success, both academically and socially. So it's really easy for us to get caught up in behaviors. But especially when we're responding to emotional dysregulation. So we can really help to not get caught up in that by thinking about these as connection seeking behaviors, and remembering if we do get caught up in the behavior and maybe don't have like the best response, repair is possible. And that's really important because one, we're teaching kiddos that it's okay to admit when we make a mistake, and we can repair, we can teach them how to do that and how to say I'm sorry, and we can repair with that connection, and that is going to elicit some oxytocin, which is that love hormone. It's associated with empathy, trust, and relationship building. So being able to go to a kid and like, hey, I had a big reaction. It was not okay when I yelled at you. And I'm really sorry that I used my big grown-up voice. That must have been really scary. I will try to do better in the future. That's a great way to repair your saying, like, I'm sorry I did this thing. I know it was wrong and I'm gonna try to do better. When we're thinking about behavior, it's also important to consider stage before age. So for a lot of our kiddos, because of that early brain development and those disruptions, that we might see some delays. And when stress is impacting the brain, we might see some regression there. So if I physically have a 9-year-old in my office who gets dysregulated, we might regress back to like the age of 5. And so I can't respond the way I would to a 9-year-old. I need to respond at our 5-year-old stage because that's where they're at right now. So a lot of times it's thinking about like, does this child have the skill to do this? And responding from that place. We obviously go to the feelings first, like we've talked about, and remembering that like all of these behaviors are really connection seeking behaviors. So how can I connect with this kiddo to help move forward from this point? And when we're thinking about regulation, we can think about the 6 R's. This is a concept from Dr. Bruce Perry. We can think about things that help us regulate, the first of which being that relationship and a relational. Hopefully that's with a safe adult, but that's really going to help us regulate. If I have a calm human that's next to me when I'm feeling really out of control, both as a kid and as an adult, right? I'm going to start to regulate and feel a little bit better. Like I have somebody here, I'm starting to feel safer. I can feed off of their energy. We want it to be relevant. So we want it to be developmentally matched to the child. So again, that's that stage before age. Things that are repetitive or patterned in nature. When we are dysregulated, again, our brain is not functioning and it's not firing at all on all cylinders. So having things that are patterned that we don't have to really think about and can just do and help our body start to calm, that's really helpful. We want it to be rewarding, right? And pleasurable. If I have a kid that I know gets, has some sensory dysregulation and they don't like the feel of a certain thing, when they are dysregulated and me reaching for that, that's not going to be helpful. So we want to make sure we're doing things that are pleasurable and rewarding and just feel good. Things that are rhythmic, those are going to help with those neural patterns in our brain and hopefully increase that integration between the two sides of the brain. And then of course we want to be respectful. We want to be respectful of the child and respectful of the family that we're working with. And all of those things are going to help us with regulation. So how in the world do we regulate? So I'm going to give you a couple of ideas. Again, this is not a one size fits all kind of thing. So sometimes you're just doing things and using your relationship to try to help. Because again, that relationship is key. So if I think about, somebody coming into my office and yelling at me and being really frustrated and like, Denise, I'm so mad at you. And if I yell back, we're just going to keep yelling, right? And we're going to yell and we're going to increase that dysregulation for both of us. If they come at me with they're so mad and I say like, I can see you're really mad and frustrated and I'm here and let me help you, or I'm here with you in this, they're going to start to match my calm. And that's what we want to do when somebody's dysregulated, is help them match us and match our energy. So some ideas for regulation. I have bubbles everywhere. We have them all over our offices. Bubbles. I have never met a child who doesn't like bubbles. I'm sure there are some that exist somewhere. But bubbles are one of those things that are just like super rewarding and pleasing. And also there's like a shared like, oh my gosh, I let you do bubbles inside, where most people do bubbles outside. However, bubbles are just soap. So we blow bubbles all over the place. And I had a kid teach me this in session once, where you can blow really big bubbles if you use a really slow, steady stream of air. So I teach everybody that at the beginning, and it's normally like, look what I can do, and kind of like show them that. But what it's teaching them is some deep breathing too, because they have to take that big breath and that slow exhale for the bubble. So if I have a kiddo who's dysregulated and we're blowing bubbles, I might say like, do you think you can blow like a really big bubble? And so not only are they doing something rewarding and pleasing, they're starting to incorporate some of that deep breathing in. Because if you say to a kid who's dysregulated, or any kid, like, do you want to take some deep breaths? No, that sounds terrible. And they rarely want to do it. If you teach them deep breathing, you have to teach them fun ways like ninja breathing. And ninja breathing is who can make the quietest breath, because ninjas are super quiet. And so sometimes kids are like, yeah, let's ninja breathe. But you really have to kind of sometimes trick them into doing that deep breathing. Drumming can be really helpful as a regulation activity, having some bongos, and doing different like patterns. I don't have bongos, but like you can drum on like your desk if you're in an office, or the wall, or anything. And I might make a pattern and they follow it, or I have them do it, or we just start lightly drumming together, and trying to do that rhythmic pattern activity. Dancing and movement can be really helpful in these moments. So some kids, when they are dysregulated, they need to move. And so I might put on a song and we dance to it. There are some songs that tell you specific things to do. There's one that I use called like Move and Freeze. I'm sure there's a lot of other ones out there. But sometimes it's just like, put on a song and we move our bodies, and we just focus on being safe with our bodies, but whatever is going on internally, we get out. So sometimes when I see a kid is struggling with a feeling, we might call those wiggles, especially if they aren't able yet to identify those sensations. So I'll be like, do you have some wiggles in your tummy? And then we just wiggle them out. So we dance, or we shake, or we do something to get that movement going. Singing can be a really great way to do that. That's going to build that relationship connection too. So I'm sorry if this gets stuck in anybody's head, but Baby Shark is a really great one to do that singing with. And it's an easy one to remember. So you can sing with your kiddos. And Catch has that rhythmic and that pattern. So I do Catch in a couple of different ways. Sometimes, especially with young kids, it's sitting on the floor and rolling the ball back and forth. And we might not talk and we just roll. Sometimes we can actually physically catch the ball. However, with dysregulated bodies, we're not always thinking about how do I be safe with the ball quite yet. And so I keep a blown up balloon in in my office and in the playroom, because one, balloons don't hurt when they get whipped at our face. Balloons are associated with like positive things too. Like it's a rewarding thing. And so that balloon toss is like soft and it's a great connection piece, it usually turns into a game with like, how long do you think we can keep it in the air? And it just starts to help regulate that movement and get that body back on, our brain back online. So different types of movement, walking can be a great one, but also like rocking with a kid. We had a kiddo just kind of naturally do this, and now I use it as a technique all the time. I call it bicycle feet, especially if we have a kiddo who wants to like run away. So to help them get that energy out, I might have them lay on their back and they put their feet up, and caregivers' hands are going to be on the feet or my hands, and we pretend to pedal a bicycle. And then I might narrate a story while we're doing it. Like we're just going down the street and it's nice and pretty. And then we see a hill and we got to bike up the hill. And so I start like, we apply more pressure to the feet and we slowly go, and then we go down the hill and it's really fast. And it helps to get some of that dysregulation out and hopefully negate like them just taking off from wherever you are. I see a lot of that mastery dysregulation when I'm doing something artsy with a kiddo and maybe drawing. All of my kids that I've worked with have experienced toxic stress. So that might be part of why I get these big reactions as well. But they might start to really struggle when they make a mistake when they're drawing something, and then we start to shut down, or we have a hard time. So I want to do something that like doesn't take a lot of brain power and makes us giggle. So I do something called the scribble war, and we each pick a color. And I put 30 seconds on the clock typically. And the goal of the scribble war is whoever's color is most dominant on the page is the winner of the scribble war. I always let the kid win, even if it looks like I have more color. I announce them as the winner, because the last thing you want to do when a kiddo's dysregulated is be like, I won, and you lost. So they always win. But we just scribble and we take 30 seconds to do that. And then as they're going, I might get like a little bit of the more giggles going by like coloring on their color or hitting their crayon with my crayon. And then it gets to be like an all-out war. And typically we get to the end of the 30 seconds and the kiddo is laughing and they feel more connected and they're back to regulated. So scribble wars are a really quick, easy thing to do. So really having an idea of like who's coming to see you and maybe the things that are going to best help them. There's some like routines that I might do with kiddos, especially if I know that they've experienced a lot of toxic stress and they need that regulation just built in, especially if we're going to be working on some of the things that they've experienced. So we might do some like breathing and movements. I use something called yoga pretzel cards. It's a box and they have different breathing cards and connection cards and movements that we can do. And so we just naturally do that at the beginning of session. And then I have a routine with them too, because that helps them to feel safe. We do our yoga pretzels, we do our whatever we're going to do for therapy, whether that's we play with something or we do an activity, and then we clean up, we blow bubbles always, or play with the balloon, and then we walk up front and get our sticker. And they know that that's like the sequence of events. And so that feels safe for them because they know what's coming next, and they have that routine kind of built in. So in order to regulate kids, adults have to be regulated. When little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not their chaos, not join their chaos. I love that. And I think it's a really good reminder because we can sometimes struggle with that ourselves. We're all human. We all have our own feelings. So it's important to know what's going on for ourselves. How am I feeling? What's my body language saying? What's my tone of voice? I'm sure we all wake up on days where I'm like, I'm not feeling it today. I'm really cranky. I didn't sleep well. So knowing that you might need a little extra things on those days, you might need to spend some time regulating yourself before you head out the door. What do you need before you go meet with a family? How do you help keep yourself calm? And knowing your triggers too. There are some things that might be triggering. I am not a kid who ever mixed my Play-Doh colors. I like to keep them separate. They do not mix. You play with one color and they stay separate. That is not how kids play with Play-Doh in a lot of my sessions. So I have Play-Doh specifically for that, but know that on days where I'm not feeling regulated, that might be really triggering for me. And my control piece might want to come out with like, we don't mix the Play-Doh. And I need to be aware that that could come up. And know what I need to do to manage that, because it's not going to hurt anything for the Play-Doh to be mixed. We also want to be aware of our shark music and what shark music is for kids. So I don't know if anybody's heard of that, but again, it's a concept from the book No Drama Discipline by Dan Siegel. So shark music, imagine we are watching a movie and we are getting like an overhead aerial view of like some trees and a road, and we go over a cliff and there's some rocks and some crashing waves, and we're hearing like piano music in the background, and it feels like this idyllic, beautiful scene. And I know that I'm going to go watch this movie and it's going to be like great and I'm feeling relaxed. But imagine that same scene with like the theme song to Jaws playing. I don't want to go near that water. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know it's not going to be good. It is setting the tone for that. So sometimes the way that we are responding might be shark music for our kiddos. They might be feeling our responses are dangerous. So being aware of what that is, and our own shark music. When a kiddo has something that's triggering for us, how are we interpreting that behavior? Again, we might be interpreting it as like they're so manipulative, but kids are not manipulative. They're just trying to meet a need. So that might be when our shark music comes up. And that, if we're not aware of it, can really push us into our fight, flight, freeze response. So I talk a lot with people I work with, and I will say I'm really good at talking about it, not great at putting it into practice, right? Self-care. And when we do self-care, a lot of times we are doing responsive self-care. We're doing self-care and being intentional after a really hard day. And that's really important, and we should do that, and we need to take time to take care of ourselves after that. But what we should also incorporate is something I like to refer to as preventative self-care. Preventative self-care should be things that we're doing each and every day to help us stay within our window of tolerance. I don't have to earn time to take care of myself because I had a hard day. It's things that are going to help me get through the day because I did this for myself. And so it's going to like pour into our cup instead of having to refill the cup once it's depleted, right? So it might be things like exercising or taking time to journal or getting outside a little bit and just doing some things for ourselves to help us get through that. So if we think about it, we're going to think about all of us as trees. And so connections really, really matter. So if we're all a tree, when we are feeling connected with ourselves and we have a lot of supports, we develop really strong, sturdy branches. And when a bird lands in us and builds a nest, which would be stressful, right? Our branches are so strong and sturdy, we can manage it and we can handle it, and I can hold that stress. But when we're not feeling connected, our branches are not going to develop, and we're going to be more like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree. And if a bird lands on us, we are going to flop over. I can't support that. I cannot tolerate and manage the stress. So we can help everybody that we know and work with develop those big, sturdy branches by using our relationship. The biggest tool that we have is ourselves and what we do and how we show up. So how we are is just as important as what we do. So don't get caught up on like, I have to make sure I'm saying the right thing or responding. Being genuine and being there and caring and supportive is just as important as what you are saying to someone. So that's all I have for today. I'm happy if anybody has some questions, feel free to let me know. There's my contact information. If anybody has some follow-up things that they want to discuss, feel free to reach out.
Any questions for Denise? I'm not seeing any in the chat box. Are we able to share your slides, Denise?
Yep, I can send those to you, Julie.
Great, thank you.
Do you have time for, do you have to go right now? Is it over?
I have time for questions if you have questions.
I work with a lot of children who've been exposed to toxic stress, and their parents, of course, have as well. And I'm curious about your observations about a parent who is so dysregulated that they cannot keep the calm that needs to be served to the child.
Those are really hard scenarios. And so it's helping, hopefully we can get the parent into their own work so that they can manage their own triggers and responses, but really helping them to understand how their responses are impacting the kiddo and providing some of this education and helping them understand that their responses is really what's going to make change, because no amount of us doing anything is going to really make a huge change for a kiddo since we're not living with them. So it's really helpful if we can help our parents to buy into this work and help them do their own things to get regulated.
Thank you. This has been great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Denise. We really appreciate your time. I'll look for those slides and we will talk to everyone later.